At the height of British colonialism, there was an explorer that wanted to explore the deeper jungles of Africa. So he managed to hire some local porters to carry all of his equipment. And so they made a grueling hike through the depths of the jungles of Angola. And it was an exhausting day of travel on foot. And it was a fitful night of sleep. And he got up the next morning and decided that they needed to go faster and more intense. But the porters refused to go. Exasperated, he began to ask and cajole, try to bribe them and plead, and it wasn't working. So he asked, why? Why don't you guys want to go? And this is what they said to him. We're waiting for our souls to catch up with our bodies. Waiting for our souls to catch up with our bodies. Do you ever feel that way? Psychologists and mental health professionals are talking about the epidemic of the modern world. Hurried sickness. They label it a disease. Someone defined it as a malaise in which a person feels chronically short of time, and so tends to perform every task at a faster pace and gets frustrated when encountering any kind of delay. Can you relate? Do you have the disease? How do you know if you've got the disease? Well, maybe when you're in the grocery store, you're always looking for that one line that's really quicker, faster than anybody else's line, right? Or maybe when you're in your car, and you count the cars in front of you and decide what lane to be in to determine which one is going to be faster. Or if you're a speed demon, you go flying by people only to get to the stoplight 30 seconds faster than everybody else. Maybe you just can't relax. You can't enjoy quiet. You never feel satisfied. You can never leave your cell phone alone. And I know I struggle with this too. You know how many times the average person touches their cell phone every day? 2,617 times in an 18-hour day, according to the Business Insider. What a contrast between that and what the psalmist said in Psalm 16:8. I have set the Lord always before me. And I wonder, how would my life be different if God touched me in my mind as much as I touch my phone? John Ortberg put it this way: for many of us, the great danger is not that we'll renounce our faith, it's that we'll become so distracted, so rushed, so preoccupied that we'll settle for a mediocre version of it. We will live our lives skimming our lives instead of actually living them. This will destroy our passion for life and the Lord. It isn't a function of working hard. Many cultures work very hard and they're never burned out. It's not a function of time either. You know, for example, you often hear, I don't have time for that, or I need more time. But look how much time we stay in front of the TV or in social media per day. Just look at that on your phone. It tells you. See, when you have passion for someone, you can stay up all night talking to them, right? If you love to write, you can write all day. If you love to play music, you can play all day and not even know that the time is gone. Passion isn't a function of lack of time. Passion loss is a function of distraction and lack of focus and intention on our passions for our lives, but more importantly, for the Lord. And what happens when we fail to align ourselves with our passion? We substitute other things, serving and achieving for our passion. We forget that what we do doesn't validate who we are, but who we are validates what we do. In our hectic lives, we have reversed it. We have bought into the American dream. Now, we're in a series on how to restore our spiritual passion. And as I said, the enemy of passion is distraction, that tyranny of the urgent, as it's said, as it's spoken of. And when we lose our passion by being distracted, we end up serving with empty souls. This issue is dealt with effectively in Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10, the whole chapter is about distraction. The disciples were distracted with their authority to cast out demons in the first 24 verses, but they needed to rejoice in the right thing, that their names were written in heaven. And then we have the lawyer of the Good Samaritan, the story which is all about distraction. And he was distracted about, not about need, but about who was his neighbor. He needed to refocus on the quality of being a neighbor in verses 25 to 37. And then we come to this little encounter with Mary and Martha. Another story of distraction. You can find this in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. Now, as they were traveling along, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Tell her to help me." But the Lord answered and said to her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things. But only one thing is necessary. For Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her." Today we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at Martha's distraction and Mary's devotion or passion, and discover some of the causes of passion loss and the cures for restoring our passion for our lives. But first, let's look at Martha's distraction. What we're going to see here, that service to Christ can replace our passion for him. Look at this in verse 38. Now, as they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed them into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. Now, the village here is probably Bethany. It's a short distance from Jerusalem, and during his final week, he used this as a home base to go back and forth from Jerusalem to this home. Of course, Mary and Martha lived there, and Lazarus also lived there as well. Now, he might be their brother, but we don't know that for sure. But now reading this for the first time, if you can try to do that, I know this is a familiar passage, but if you were reading this for the first time, you know, right after the Good Samaritan story, you know, you'd think Martha would be the hero, right? She's opening up her home. It's the idea of opening your arms to somebody when they come to the door. The same word is used of Zacchaeus when he welcomes Jesus into his home. And she's going to serve these weary men. She's going to go the extra mile just like the Good Samaritan. But look at something to warn us about. You see, we can become distracted from our passion for the Lord by our service to him. Now in verse 39, the New King James translates this verse as, "And she had a sister called Mary who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word." Did you see that? Also. Could it be that Martha was also at Jesus' feet as well? We don't know how long. Perhaps she does what we do, right? We might sit at his feet and we begin to think about all the things that need to be done. There are 13 hungry men here that need to be fed. And let's see, what do I have on hand? What do I need? Perhaps I need to go to Big Y or Stop and Shop and pick up some things. Anxiety is the biggest killer, a big killer of passion. Distraction leads to anxiety of everything that is happening around us. Instead of focus, we end up with fear and worry. And the harder she worked, the more worked up she became. Verse 40. But Martha was distracted with all of her preparations, and she came up to him and said, "Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to serve all this serving alone? Tell her to help me." Now, the word distracted here is only used once in the New Testament. But in the literature surrounding the New Testament, it means to be pulled away because of being burdened. The opposite of this word, or the antonym of this word, is found actually in 1 Corinthians 7:35, where it means an undivided devotion of a single person who has, if he's single, in relationship to the Lord. But Martha suffered from the opposite. She has divided loyalty with all of the things that she has to do around her. And Jesus even defines this further for us in verse 41. He calls that he says to her, "You're worried and bothered." Jesus never says to her that she's too busy or that she's overcommitted. May I suggest that while busyness was certainly an issue to Martha, but the root cause of her frustration and worry was distraction. Being pulled away from what should have been her main priority. The main priority here was to sit at his feet. It's not even that we deliberately choose to put him away, or Martha chooses to push away from him. It's often something more subtle than that, isn't it? I suspect many of us are just like Martha. We have good intentions. We have invited Jesus into our lives. We welcomed him with open arms and into our homes, into our lives. But we end up missing out on his presence, and thus we get pulled away. The verb here that says that she came up to him pictures her leaving her work and stepping up to him eyeball to eyeball. And she's in his face. Martha's solution to the problem here was, it's Mary's fault. If she had been there to help, it would not have been so bad. She just isn't pulling her load. It's unfair, and I'm doing all of it. Don't you care? That's an emphatic statement. In the original language, it's worded this way: not care you? She's trying to put Jesus on the defensive, where he might say, "Oh, of course I do. Mary, go and help Martha." But that's what she expected. But Jesus doesn't take the bait. My sister has left me to do all the serving alone. No, she doesn't refer to her as Mary. Is my sister. That's the way. It's a way of disowning her. Remember the older brother and the prodigal son several chapters later, where the older son says to the father, "This son of yours is not his brother." Martha's perspective, Mary had deserted her. Another robber of passion is blaming others. Refusing to take responsibility for your lack of focus and intention and to point your finger at somebody else. Another way this happens is we blame our calendars. I don't have time. And we make time, though, for what we are passionate for. We always have time for that which we love the most. Burnout is not a function of busyness, but of lack of passion. And passion leaks. Here's Martha. She points her finger at Mary, but she really is blaming the Lord. It's your fault, Lord. You ever do that? You become overburdened, and you begin to blame others, and you even begin to blame God for your own busyness. See, we judge other people, on what we think needs to be done, don't we? It's our expectations that need to be fulfilled. We obligate ourselves and others to the job that needs to be done. An obligation leads to burnout. How? Well, we say to ourselves, well, I have to do this, and they have to do it too. And when we do that, we have lost our focus. And because of that, we do things out of obligation and not love. I think sometimes it can be very hard on the Marthas of this world, but faced with a very similar issue, we probably do the very same thing, right? How many times do we blame someone else for the fact that we're pulled away? At work, at home, in a relationship. See, we quit on responsibilities and people because we have become distracted. Could it be that this is what the post-COVID church suffers from? We can't quit on our responsibilities because we have become distracted with the things of our world and the time that we have. So she told Jesus, if you really cared, you would say something to her. We often think that we know how the Lord should and should lighten the load in our lives, don't we? Right? He does lighten our loads, but not in the way that we expect. Of course, if we were there, if I was there, I'd probably say, well, talk to her. She's sitting right over there. What are you talking to me for, right? So I think that Mary and Martha perhaps had some words. They had eye contact, the eye, or the elbows back and forth. But that didn't work. So Martha gets in Jesus' face. Notice Jesus' response. He essentially says something very non-defensively. He says, you need to refocus your devotion. And so do we. Verse 41, but the Lord answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things. Martha, Martha. In the original language, it's called a double vocative. And it has the idea of a tender response of deep emotion and care. He's not scolding her. He's reaching out to care for her worry and her frustration. The problem wasn't the work. And it often isn't the work, right? But it was her attitude of fretting and worrying. She was busy not because the calendar demanded it, because her heart demanded it. See, we often lose our passion not because of our schedules, but because of our hearts. And thus we lose our focus and we lose our intention. He didn't rebuke her for making preparations for him or the disciples. He was merely illustrating a point and said that man shall not live by bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. She didn't need to make an elaborate meal. A simple one would have been fine. Without thinking, we can turn what is a means of living for God into an end in itself. We all need to work. We all need to eat food and to serve. But we can use that as an end in itself instead of a means to something greater. Or worse, it can become a form of distraction and we lose our focus and passion. And our spiritual lives are not based upon serving. It's based upon intimacy and passion for the Lord. Notice what he says in verse 42. But one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion. He didn't condemn Martha, but Mary chose the one meal, the good portion. And Jesus is making a little bit of a wordplay here. And so let me paraphrase it so that it comes through stronger. Martha, you were preparing many dishes for us to eat, but Mary has prepared a dish that you can't fix in your kitchen. The one dish Martha should have been preparing for was her passion and devotion for him, but she didn't. Martha has allowed service to pull her away from her passion and devotion at Christ's feet. And if we're not careful, we can allow service in the church to pull us away from the very person that we're serving. Satan loves to help people to sin while they're being spiritual, right? While we're serving, while we're ministering to others. Corrie ten Boom says it this way: if the devil can't make you sin, he'll make you busy. So we looked at Martha's distraction. Now let's look at Mary's passion. What we're going to see here is that making intimacy or passion for Christ the focus, we're going to discover that it serves as a source of all of our service and all that we do towards others. 39. She had a sister called Mary who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his word. Mary was sitting at the Lord's feet in quietness and closeness of a disciple. At the feet of the rabbi was a position of being a disciple. The verb to sit here has a reflexive force to it. In other words, she took the initiative to sit there. It's the posture of a disciple that is usually meant for men. And here we see Mary in that place. It's a technical term of a relationship between a student and a teacher. Paul was seated at Gamaliel's feet in Acts 22:3. So both Christ and Mary are running against the culture of the day, since women were not to be in this posture. Ray Vanderland notes that the first century Jews had a blessing that beautifully expresses the commitment of a disciple to stay in the presence of the one he's following. It goes like this: may you always be covered by the dust of the rabbi, of your rabbi. That is, may you follow him so closely that the dust his feet kicks is what covers your clothing and the lines in your face. We need that, don't we? We need to be covered with the dust of Jesus as we follow him. And may I ask you this morning, how dirty are you? Note that she's sitting at the Lord's feet, her master. And what's she doing? She's listening to his word. The word listening here is akuo, or it's where we get our word acoustic. She's listening. Her attention, her focus, her passion was to listen to what he was saying and to literally listen to his word, his logos, his word. When Liam, our last son, was born, as you know, and when he's born, they often put the child in either an incubator or a bassinet, and it has a warm air blowing down on him, And this air was blowing down, but he was crying. He kept crying and crying and crying. And so finally I moved away from Karn and stepped over there and I said, "Look, hey, Liam, what's going on?" And he stopped. And the nurse goes, "Oh, he knows your voice." "What?" "He knows your voice." "What do you knows my voice?" He's just heard you talking in the room. He hears you. He knows my voice. Do we know his voice in our crying, in our frustration, in our lives? When was the last time you really listened to Jesus? Not just read his word, but listened to him. I don't mean hearing some disembodied voice. What I mean is that you listen by looking at his word in such a way that you become aware of your intentions, your focus, your obedience, your devotion, your sensitivity, your receptivity, and your ability to take it in. Now, that doesn't have to take place in isolation. It helps, but you can be sitting at Jesus' feet when you're kneeling in prayer, or negotiating a contract, or fixing the kids' lunch, or doing emails, or watching a movie. All it requires is asking Jesus to be our teacher and companion at that moment. To be with him in what we were doing. It's about becoming increasingly aware of what he's trying to teach us, or what he would actually do and say in a situation like the one that we're in. That brings passion to our lives because our focus and attention is on him. And don't we long for that in our own lives? Well, he's here right now. You can sit at his feet right here and right now. And may I invite you to do that. Whatever your thoughts are, whatever you're doing, you can sit at his feet right now. By making intimacy with him and passion for Christ a priority, it will make intimacy the source of all that we do in terms of service. Notice this in verse 42. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. Notice, Mary has chosen. Devotion and passion for Christ has a price tag. It must be chosen over a lot of very good things. It must be the better thing that we do. Otherwise, our passion will suffer. Our focus and intention will become blurry. And it will not be taken away from her. Our passion can always be the basis upon which we serve. For this passion for him is a heart out of which all things flow, such as service, ministry, mercy, grace. It'll serve as the foundation that will not be shaken. Yes, we can lose our focus. Yes, we can become distracted, but our foundation is always, always available to us. And it's available right now. Beware of anything that competes with your loyalty to Jesus Christ. The greatest competitor of devotion to Jesus is service to him. Oswald Chambers. If you don't take anything else away from the talk today, take this statement away. If our output exceeds our input, our upkeep will be our downfall. Let me say it again. If our output exceeds our input, our upkeep will be our downfall. And of course, there is a flip side to this, isn't there? The risk is always to say, well, I'm not ready yet. You know, we use our lack of personal intimacy and passion as an excuse not to serve. And this is what I call the holy huddle syndrome. If you're sitting at Jesus' feet as a disciple and not seeing service as an outflow of your life, then your lack of private devotion can be used as an excuse not to serve. And we have to be on guard about that. The solution isn't to stop serving altogether, but to see it as an outflow of our intimacy with Him and our passion for Him. As I close, who do you resemble the most? Martha or Mary? How do we begin to look more like Mary? How do we move from service to Christ to intimacy with Him? And how do we move from being a Martha to a Mary? Now, I want to be careful here, because Jesus doesn't say that Martha has to change her temperament or personality. There's nothing wrong with being a doer or being a Martha. But what you do as a Martha is important. By the way, men can be Marthas too. This issue isn't gender specific. But Jesus points to Mary and her posture as something that we should emulate. There are three things that I think we can put into practice that can help us toward restoring our spiritual practice based on this passage, our passion. First one is look up to God. At His feet, look up and discover the grace of silence. Train yourself to sense His voice in your life through His Word. And that's practice. Like Jesus, we also have to develop a clear sense of our mission so that, we can invest our time with God's purposes in mind. And we should also develop an understanding of our own limitations, right? So that we can budget that time with the Father by restoring our inner resources. There are many good things you can do, but the good can often become the enemy of the best, right? And realize that rest requires faith. Because it seems unproductive, doesn't it, by the world's view. Since you cannot measure the product of time spent in developing a relationship with God and people, we often don't do it. But it takes a risk to invest in a significant amount of time in these things. Beware when we look into His face of the human tendency to avoid an honest examination of ourselves in His presence. Many people seek diversions and distractions and busyness to elude this encounter because we are afraid of God. And we have to know fundamentally that He's for us and not against us. So look up. Next, line up your priorities. Establish a time, a consistent place, a strategy for that time. Budget time in advance for the important things that could be swept away by the daily grind, right? If we do not learn to make the urgent things flow around the important will be overwhelmed by the urgent. Ask yourself, how much is enough in what we do spiritually and what we do physically? The lack of focus and intention will kill contentment and drive you to greater busyness and distraction. I used to tell my kids, if you don't decide about life, life's going to decide for you. And that's the same true when we pursue God. If we don't decide what we're going to do, the circumstances that we find ourselves in will determine what we do. Look up. Line up. Lighten up. Lighten up your life. Get some life-o-suction. Put your junk on the operating table of God. What are you saying no to? Anne Lamott says that no is a complete sentence. Free yourself from bondage to the opinions, the agendas, and the expectations of others. Learn to say no to invitations and requests that may flatter you, but they will drain your energy and your passion. A skilled engineer set out to build his very own boat. It was quite an elaborate boat with numerous sails and the latest technology. When he had finished, he took it out into the open sea and he hit some rough waters, and the boat capsized. After further investigation, it was discovered that there wasn't any ballast in the bottom of the boat to keep it steady in the water. So what was above the water looked good and seemed to work fine, but there wasn't anything below the water to keep it steady when the storms came. Your passion for Christ will keep you steady when the storms of life come. To the ballast of our life is our intimacy with our passion for God. When we look up, when we line up, and when we lighten up.